Simon Harry here, looking as always to bring a fresh, independent perspective to investing. I'm here with Raj Lala, who has a truly unique investment opportunity when it comes to trying to reduce the carbon footprint of your investment portfolio. Raj Lala is the CEO of Evolve Etfs, and I'm really happy that he's got some time to share with us today. Welcome, Raj.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Just a pleasure. So Raj, could you tell us a bit about the clean beta ETFs?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. We actually launched our first set of funds 4 years ago this month. So back in 2017, we're currently closing in on $2 billion in assets. So we've actually been one of the fastest growing ETF providers in the country. And our fund lineup's really categorized into 5 areas: disruptive technology, which is where we've really built a strong reputation for ourselves. We also have fixed income. We also have some equity yield products. And then of course, clean beta, which is new additions to our fund family. And this is really, our foray into the ESG space. When we decided we wanted to enter, and as you probably know, there's a lot of ESG type products out there, we really wanted to take a different approach to it. And we looked at a lot of the objections and challenges that exist for investors as it relates to ESG investing. And what we wanted to do was address them. Things like unclear screening methodologies, things like changing of the return profile, things like exclusionary. So what we effectively did is we approached S&P, Standard & Poor's, to license 2 of their primary indices that probably many investors have exposure to, which is the S&P 500 and the TSX 60. And then they provide us with a carbon emission calculation on the constituents of those indices. And then we go out there and we actually acquire and then retire enough carbon offsets to provide investors a carbon neutral version of the TSX 60 and the S&P 500. It's first time anybody's done this in the world. We're pretty excited about these products. As I mentioned, we just launched them very recently. So we think that they're going to be incredibly successful over the next few years.
As you mentioned, everybody's got a different thought on what is important to them when it comes to investing in the environmental, social, and governance space, ESG investing. The take, it seems, that you're taking is a much more direct approach where you're trying to offset the carbon that is generated by your investment portfolios.
That's right. Yeah, it is a very different approach to ESG investing. And again, there are challenges related to ESG, but one of the biggest one is that it's very exclusionary, meaning that you're screening out companies. And when you screen out companies within an ESG, a typical ESG portfolio, that also means that you're changing the overall return profile that an investor can expect. So our approach, by effectively decarbonizing the TSX 60 and the S&P 500, you know exactly what your return profile is going to be. It's going to be the S&P 500 minus the costs of the fund, or the TSX 60 minus the cost. So we're not changing your return profile. It's just effectively decarbonizing it.
So the primary investments that the clients are holding inside of your ETFs are the TSX 60 and the S&P 500. So here in Canada, you'd be looking at companies like Bell Canada, Rogers, TELUS, CP Rail, CNR, Suncor, Canadian Natural Resources, TransCanada Pipeline, Enbridge, just to name a bunch of them. You're going to be figuring out how much carbon these companies are actually emitting per share, and then buying carbon offsets to offset that carbon. Can you tell us about how you figure out how much carbon is being produced, and tell us a bit about the carbon offsets?
Sure. Happy to do that. So S&P actually owns a company called Trucost. Trucost is actually considered to be one of the leaders, if not the leader, in calculating carbon emissions for about 15,000 companies around the world, including the companies that are part of the S&P's primary indices. And they calculate those carbon emissions once a year. And what they do is they deliver to us a calculation based on the amount of emissions attributed to $1 million invested in that index. So if you invested $1 million in the S&P 500, there would be an attributable 50 metric tons of carbon emissions. We then take that calculation and then we go out there and we acquire enough carbon credits so that we can actually deliver that carbon neutral version of the S&P 500.
So $1 million invested in the S&P 500 emits approximately 50 metric tons of carbon a year?
You got it. And it's worse for the TSX 60 because we have a lot of energy and a lot of resource companies in there as well. So you're closer to about 75, 76 metric tons of carbon emissions per $1 million invested.
So when you're buying the carbon offsets, where does that money go? Where do those purchases end up? What happens?
Yeah, so the easiest way to kind of explain it is through an example. Let's say you, Simon, owned 1 million acres of land and you had two choices to make. One of your choices is that you're going to turn it into, I don't know, a mall or a parking lot or something like that. The other choice that you could make is you could plant some trees on that property. You're going to look at the commercial aspects of it and say, well, I probably want to build a mall or a parking lot on it because I'll make more money. And so what carbon credits do is really incentivize you, in this example, to plant those trees, because you will go and, let's say, plant 10 million trees on the 1 million acres of land that you own. Then what you'll do is you'll go to one of the registries. And these registries like Gold Council or Gold Standard, or Verra, for example, would do an entire examination of your exercise here. So did you plant those 10 million trees on that land? How big were the trees? How old are they? So that they could calculate out how much carbon dioxide is actually going to be taken out of our atmosphere via these trees. Based on that calculation, they will then award you these carbon credits. Now, you will take those carbon credits and you can go and sell them to governments. You can go and sell them to companies that need to ultimately reduce their overall carbon footprint. So it becomes somewhat of a revenue generation exercise for you. But also what it does is it takes some of the carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere, which we obviously need very badly.
And what is the cost of purchasing these carbon credits?
So right now, it's going to be a variable cost because the amount of metric tons per $1 million invested is going to change on a monthly basis, not just because the carbon emission calculation changes every year for the companies, but also the weightings changes. So for example, let's say Suncor becomes the biggest company on the TSX. That means the carbon emission calculation may go up because they may be a bigger emitter than one of the banks, for example. So that's going to be a variable calculation. But historically, it's been pretty stable. Like the last few years on the S&P 500 has been roughly about 50 metric tons, as I said before. And so the cost of a high quality carbon credit is about $20. So you take that $20, you multiply, and each credit represents 1 metric ton of carbon emissions. So you take that $20, you multiply it by the $50, and you get to 10 basis points on $1 million invested. And in the case of the TSX 60, as I said earlier, you have a higher carbon emission calculation because you have more energy and resource companies in that index. It's going to roughly cost about 16 basis points to effectively decarbonize those indices.
And so that translates 10 basis points would be about $1,000 per million.
That's right.
One question that does spring to mind is when you do purchase these carbon credits, are they permanent purchases, or are they, or after a year, do you need to purchase more?
You need to purchase them. We are actually purchasing the credits every month because we have investors coming in to the fund, of course, on a monthly basis, let's say. And so it requires us to decarbonize their investment. So if you put, let's use that example of $1 million in on September 15th, we would then go out that we would effectively book into our net asset value or our NAV the cost of those carbon credits. And then at the end of the month, we would go out there and acquire the appropriate amount of credit. So we're actually buying credits typically on a monthly or quarterly basis.
Is there anything that you think is important to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I do. I think, we covered at the beginning in terms of the challenges that many investors have with ESG investing, and there's a number of them. We know that more and more investors are starting to gravitate towards ESG principles in their portfolios. When you think about things big picture, we are now in this world where, for example, last year, there were 40 billion tons emitted into our atmosphere of greenhouse gases. About 80% of greenhouse gases are from carbon dioxide. So we really need to get this under control. And ultimately, what it means is over the next 5 years, we need to start removing about 4 billion metric tons from our atmosphere. That's a big number. But if we don't start doing that now, then we're going to have a much bigger challenge to get to, as many of your viewers know, we all have this global aspiration to get to net zero by 2050. And what that means effectively is to limit the amount of increase of our temperature on our planet to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we don't start taking this seriously soon, it's going to be very difficult to get to that goal. The role of carbon credits is critical for a transition to get to net zero. I often say to investors, in a perfect world, our fund doesn't exist because ultimately these companies are not emitting carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, so you wouldn't need carbon credits to offset. But unfortunately, we don't live in that perfect world, and it's going to take us a while to develop the technologies and the hygiene and the practices to ultimately start to reduce our overall emissions into the atmosphere. So what we really like about carbon credits is they're a really great transitionary tool. If anybody has watched, Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, I mean, he has said many times that carbon credits are going to be essential from a transitionary perspective to get to net zero. So what we're doing is utilizing those credits within the fund so that you as investors can neutralize your carbon footprint via your investments.
That is fabulous. Thank you very much for taking some time with us today, Raj. Really, really appreciate it. One thing I want to say is that any investment that you make in your portfolio really should be done in consultation with your investment advisor. It's very important to do your own research and due diligence before you do make a purchase. But this is, in my mind, one of the most unique investments that is out there. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to slice and dice ESG in many different ways, but this is one that is a direct offset to the amount of carbon that your portfolio makes. And if interested, reach out to me, reach out to, Google Evolve Etfs and check out what that team has to offer as well. Thanks very, very much for your time, Raj. Really appreciate it. And hope you have a fabulous day.
Thanks, Simon.